This is the Human Action Podcast with your hosts, Jeff Deist and Dr. Bob Murphy.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back once again to another episode of the Human Action Podcast. As you can see, I'm joined by my weekly co-host, Dr. Bob Murphy, but I'm also joined by Mises Institute economist and senior editor, Ryan McMaken. Great to see you guys. How you doing, Ryan?
It's great to be with you.
Well, earlier this week, just yesterday, in fact, Jerome Powell was forced to endure one of his biannual testimonies before the Senate Banking Committee. He doesn't seem like he particularly enjoys that. So the subject of our show relates to that testimony, which is basically, are we in a recession? And if so, how bad is it? And how bad is it likely to get? Now, I've noticed, guys, that both Chairman Powell and Secretary Janet Yellen have been a little bit more muted on the state of the economy than have Joe Biden himself, who just recently, during that hapless weekend over Father's Day up in Rehoboth Beach, Delaware, he had that bicycle fall incident. He was asked by a reporter whether or not we were in a recession. He said, "Oh, you sound like a right-wing economist or something." So he was snapping back and saying, we're not currently in a recession. And also his press person, Karine Jean-Pierre, said the same thing earlier this week at one of the White House daily briefings. So I guess for starters, we all know this standard definition of a recession is 2 consecutive quarters with negative GDP growth. The Austrian school has a little bit different perspective on that, but I'll throw it out to you gentlemen for starters. Are we in a recession? It sure feels like we are.
Well, in terms of the technical definition of a recession, that still is unknown because that depends on the definitions put out by various organizations and your interpretation of the numbers. And I think the real question is, do people feel like they're in a recession? Because people know. And just like before we got into this technical idea of what is a recession based on 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth and all that sort of thing, people just spoke more informally about good times and bad times. And that's what really drove people's feelings about what is the state of the economy. And you didn't have people trying to tell them to their face and insult them to their face and tell them, you're doing fine, everything's fine, because the aggregate numbers say things are fine. Whereas you might have had millions of people then in really bad shape because of the state of the actual economy. And I think we are in a situation where lots of people feel that they are doing worse. And we have seen that in the aggregate data, which when we're looking at, say, real wage growth and average weekly earnings, to be specific, that's not keeping up with the price inflation rate. And on top of that, of course, we're seeing that savings are plummeting. We're seeing that credit card debt is climbing quickly. We're seeing that the amount that people are having to pay on their mortgages or on their rent is climbing fast. And so did GDP climb 0.2% this quarter? And so we averted a recession? Maybe, but that's going to be not much comfort to a lot of people.
Yeah, I would just make the distinction between like a bad economy and what people mean by a recession. So we could be in bad straits. You know, if everyone could feel poor, they could realize that, oh, wow, my wages aren't keeping up. But if you still had a job, you know, some people might quibble and say, okay, that's just a bad economy. That's not a recession per se. So I think, yeah, by anybody's definition, a recession's definitely coming. We pointed out, Jeff, if you remember at that Orlando event that we did, in terms of the yield curve, which is a particular measure people use, the 10-year, 2-year version of that did recently invert back in April, but the one that's really got the good track record is the 10-year, 3-month, and technically that's still like 1.5 percentage points. Like it still has to move down, but it is moving downward. So it wouldn't surprise me if in the near future that technically goes negative. And then, you know, even by the official definitions, you have a recession, which means, you know, things like rising unemployment. So right now, the official unemployment rate is still low. Even that's misleading. I know most of the viewers already know this stuff, but I just went to look up what the numbers were. Right now, if you just ask what's total employment, like how many jobs are there, that number's like 900,000 less than it was at the peak right before the pandemic hit. And then especially if you're looking like the upward trajectory, right? So that number was growing over time. So it's not just the mismatch in absolute terms, but had that number kept rising on the previous trend, you know, we're at 1 and some change million jobs short of where things would have been, in the alternate timeline when everything was fine. So certainly even the labor markets, even though people are telling us they're tight, record job growth, things like that, they're not back to where they were before the pandemic, despite the official unemployment rate. And of course, like, Ryan's saying, just going to the gas station, that's painful. So whether we call it a recession or not, it's clear that definitely we're in bad shape. I think it's going to get worse. And at some point, even by the official measures, the recession's going to be here.
Well, if it's about how people feel or if people imagine there actually are poorer or worse off, I guess in theory, and disagree if you care to, in theory, we could have a growing economy, but inflation is growing more quickly. And so people still feel like they're getting poorer, even if they're getting small raises at work or whatever. And I guess also if you could have a growing economy and a quickly growing population where these aggregate numbers that the profession of economics loves so much, the aggregate numbers could be growing even while per capita wealth or per capita income was shrinking. So the idea that a good economy in terms of people's feelings or emotions or attitudes or perceptions or even their reality and a growing economy are 100% synonymous, I would say that's not necessarily true.
Oh, right. Yeah, there's lots of distinctions we can make. And again, though, I'm just saying that if we think about like the typical boom bust cycle, one of the attributes of is there a recession or a depression or a crash is often that, the unemployment rate shoots up and people can't find work. And so I'm saying right now, I think there is a sense that people realize, wow, prices are rising. I can't keep up. My paycheck is not rising as fast, but a lot of people still have paychecks. And so I think that's the next shoe that's going to drop.
Right.
Even though, again, the official numbers are making it look better than it really is.
Well, I know that the Biden administration has been quick to point to unemployment as one of the few rosy statistics happening right now. I wonder, is that a good statistic to look at? I mean, is unemployment the kind of thing that normally leads or lags when it comes to recessions?
I think typically it would be a lagging indicator. So that, in other words, because I think for a lot of people, like the unemployment rate is almost synonymous with what we mean by, a recession. So if the unemployment rate hits 10%, it's not saying, a recession's coming. It's like, no, a recession's here if unemployment's that high. So yeah, I think people would look to other things and, in terms of that. Let me just mention too, that in case no one's ever heard this before, officially, so what's going on is like, how could it be that I just mentioned a couple minutes ago, total employment is lower than it was at the peak before the coronavirus stuff, happened, but the unemployment rate is really low. And it's because technically the way economists measure it, you have to be looking for work. So so somebody who's 75 years old and retired and just golfing every day, they're not counted among the ranks of the employed. And so part of it is that funky business of some people just dropped out of the labor force altogether. And so the total job amount is not the same as it was, even though the unemployment rate officially is pretty low.
It also comes down to standard of living issues, too, I think is often how people really think in terms of, is the economy doing well or not? Am I doing better? Did I have to downsize to a smaller apartment even though I still have a job? And I think that's a real fear, and something that could really happen is you have something happen like happened in Japan, where they haven't had big recessions. They haven't had a bunch of economic crises there, but they are in a situation where you have a lot of people working very, very hard to maintain a standard of living that just really isn't expanding very much for very many people. And you see that reflected somewhat in the birth rate as well, as you just have fewer and fewer people having children, having fewer children. And the reason they give a lot of the time is I can't even attain the standard of living that my parents had. And so when people look at that, regardless of whether the economy is actually shrinking or you're meeting any sort of technical idea of a recession, if you're having to just do with less and less, even if you have a job and you're doing fairly okay, I think that's a real measure that people can start to look at, and that can come with real political repercussions as well.
Well, let's take a look at this idea of a textbook definition of a recession, which again is 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth. Frank Shostak, who writes for Mises.org quite a bit, he has an article saying, no. What a recession is should be viewed in terms of money. It's a monetary issue. It's not about GDP, and GDP is infirm as a measure of recession for a few different reasons. First of all, it's an aggregate you're comparing different, radically different asset classes. It's expressed in dollar terms, and of course, dollars are manipulable because part of what GDP includes government spending, for example. So you can juice GDP in a lot of different ways. It nets out exports and imports, which is a little dicey in terms of an Austrian perspective of productivity growth. And for all of these reasons, he says, the traditional definition of a recession doesn't really help us understand. He says we ought to be looking at the rate of growth of new money because that is the destructive force in the economy. That's what's destroying wealth or eliminating the prospects for potential new wealth to be created under a more Austrian definition or an Austrian conception of the business cycle. So do you agree with Shostak? Is a recession a monetary phenomenon, not a GDP phenomenon?
So yeah, I'll tackle that. I think that he's right, and just to give an example to people in terms of like why looking at GDP, and we mean real GDP that they theoretically adjust for price inflation with this stuff, is very misleading. Is if you look at the official statistics that the government puts out during the what quote got us out of the Great Depression. Oh, it was World War II, the military spending, and if you just look at the official numbers, that real GDP just shot through the roof when the U.S. entered World War II and the government started spending all that money on tanks and so forth. And, and Bob Higgs points out that there's multiple problems with that. But one thing that I think a lot of people don't know is they had price controls in effect. And so that really screwed up the calculation. And they didn't even take that into account. So in other words, the Fed was creating a lot of new money to help finance the wartime borrowing and spending. So in a normal economy, that would have made prices rise. So yes, nominal GDP, the total number of dollars spent on goods and services went way up, partly because they're printing a lot of money. And then the denominator would have gone up because, the average price level, as it were. But legally, they didn't allow that to happen. So that was a double whammy in terms of why the official real GDP numbers shot through the roof. And like Bob Higgs said, they didn't even, it's not that I clarified with him once I was writing a book on this, and I asked him, are you saying you think they didn't do an adequate adjustment or they didn't adjust it at all? He said they didn't adjust it at all. They didn't take into account price controls whatsoever when they published those numbers. So that's just showing, again, how crazy it is to look at that stuff. And again, like Ryan's saying with the standard of living, besides just it being manipulable, but just in terms of the concept, yes, there's a sense in which what else are we going to measure real output in except dollar terms or money terms, depending on what the currency is. But if consumers are spending money on cars and radios and food, there's a sense in which those dollars are interchangeable and they're making their choices. So that's the rationale for why you would treat them like as a sense of measurement of output, if you will. But when the government forcibly takes it and then gives contracts to, defense contractors and through a political process, putting your own personal views aside as to whether that's a good idea or not, clearly that's not the same thing. It's not a voluntary process. And so the money that the government spends on things really just economically is not the same thing. And so that really shouldn't be going into the calculation at all.
Now we nod. Ryan?
Well, it's because of the way that GDP is measured that obviously it benefits the state in a variety of ways, right? And so from a political economy sort of standpoint, I mean, it's a great tool for the government because it allows then the government to claim that it can fine-tune things while at the same time being able to manipulate some of the main inputs that go into the actual growth of GDP. So, I mean, really to make that the main pillar of your monetary and fiscal policy is just a recipe for disaster because there are so many ways that the state can then manipulate it itself and then go back and say, well, based on what this number is, we need to do X, Y, Z. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, they can come back later and say, well, we did X, Y, Z, and look, these things improved. Whereas, of course, you could do that during World War II for any number of reasons. And then looking back, though, at what happened to the actual American standard of living during the Second World War, it didn't go up at all. If anything, it went down. That was the time of ration books, and there were you had to recycle everything, and it was in some goods and services you just couldn't get. Gasoline was extremely difficult to get. So this idea that GDP went up, so everybody must have been doing better during that time period. There's just no connection there whatsoever.
Yeah, isn't that sick? The idea that a measure of the health of an economy or the economic health or material prosperity of a society could increase during a war. I mean, we're talking about an enormously destructive event, literally destructive across Europe, across North Africa and Russia, in Pearl Harbor, for example, but also even in the United States, enormously destructive in terms of the kinds of goods and services that people would actually want in a normal economy absent this war intervention. Versus what was actually produced and where resources were actually sent, not to mention the human resources of a bunch of U.S. GIs who got killed or blown up or damaged and certainly lost a few years of income and career growth or going to college or whatever those young men and some young women would have done. So I think we should point that out, just how sick and almost demonic it is that we would consider World War II a boon to GDP. I mean, that shows you first and foremost that GDP is just enormously misleading at best. But can you guys elaborate a bit on what Shostak means by the rate of growth of the money supply as a better indicator of a recession or a healthy economy? In other words, that we should be keeping our eye on that. Not necessarily that goes lockstep with an economic recession as defined by GDP, but that's a better measure of how the economy is doing.
Well, sure. So I think part of what he has in mind is he's dovetailing his analysis with the theory of the boom-bust cycle that Ludwig von Mises developed, which is to say that, why is it that there are these periodic booms and busts in a market economy? Yes, over time, standards of living grow, real output per capita tends to grow, particularly, the more laissez-faire the economy is. But still, there's these clusters of errors, that there's these boom periods where everything seems good, business seems brisk, and then all of a sudden there's a bust where unemployment's high, and it seems like a bunch of businesses made mistakes, at the same time. How come it's not just spread out uniformly and some businesses go bust? But why isn't it just every year the same percentage? Why does it seem to be clusters of errors? That's the thing that the Austrians try to explain. And so Mises said that it's because through various interventions, especially if there's a central bank that exists, but there doesn't need to be, that the banking system is allowed to, by granting loans, it expands the money supply that enters the economy through the credit markets. And so in particular, that makes the rate of interest lower than it otherwise would have been. It gives the false signal, false information. The interest rate can't do its job if new money's entering the economy through the credit markets first, and so that's what causes the boom period. And in the Austrian view, there's malinvestment. So it's in the Austrian conception where the problem is occurring is when times seem good. That's when real resources, are getting plowed into lines that are unsustainable, and at some point, reality is going to reassert itself. And so then the bust, even though it feels bad, is in a sense when people are coming to their senses, and that's like the process when resources are getting moved around to where they ought to be in light of the previous errors, which have now been realized. So I think that's partly what Shostak is getting at, is that when money supply growth is unusually high, that goes hand in hand with there's a bunch of malinvestments being made right now, and so the economy, we're setting ourselves up for a crash. Even though it feels good.
Yeah, the way Frank describes it is basically you've got this growing money supply, and then on the back of that growing money supply, you have all these malinvestments. And he calls that a form of wealth destruction. And it is, because it's pulling resources away from things that would have been created and invested in had the economy been able to actually reflect what people had been saving and investing in an unhampered economy. So in an unhampered economy, people, they save and invest in certain ways that reflect what the actual demand is of the overall population. Once you start flooding the economy with money, that is unbacked money, then that starts to really distort that. And then the people who get that money first, they invest where they want, and they put money where they want, and that doesn't reflect the overall demands of the economy. So you've got then wealth diversion away from the best places, best in terms of what people valued most, and towards second best or third best, or just suboptimal purposes. So you can still have creation of things, right? We see that all around us, right? We're still building things. We're still creating things. It's not like wealth is just disappearing, but it's going into places where people really would rather it not have gone. And so that's how you get those bubbles, and that's how you get the malinvestment. And then the only way to cure that then is to have that recession.
Yeah, if I might just give an analogy for some of the viewers who maybe this is new material. So like imagine it's a giant, agricultural operation. And so that, the harvest comes in this year and they go through and they collect all the crops and so forth. And then they normally would take the seed and then plant again for next season. And so if for some reason this time around they planted in fields that, had, some chemical in it or something that rendered it just completely barren and it wasn't going to work. But right now we just got the harvest in. So everybody feels good. And it's even though the mistakes are being made right now with the seed being put in the fields that actually are not going to be able to produce anything useful. And it's not until down the road when normally the crop would come in and nothing comes in that we're going to realize, but if you ask at what point was the wealth destroyed, technically, I think you would, if you had perfect information and knew the situation, you would say, when those seeds were thrown and planted in the wrong areas, that's when the wealth was technically destroyed. Like once that was done, if that's an irrevocable decision, that's when even though everybody else would not realize the problem, it wouldn't even feel like there was a problem until down the road when everyone expected, okay, then the crop's going to come in and we're going to eat that, right? And then all of a sudden there's no food. So I think that's part of the problem with the modern complex capital rich economy is that a lot of these processes take years, to come to fruition. And so if malinvestments are being made, you don't realize the problem until sometimes years down the road.
Well, I think the situation you two have just described explains why politics beats economics every time, because economists don't do a very good job, or they don't do a good enough job of showing us the unseen. What would have been absent these interventions, war, monetary policy, fiscal policy, whatever it might be. So a politician, it's very easy to say, since the crash of 07-08, look how low consumer price inflation has been. Or, we look at this beautiful new public housing project we bought. Or, look at our new fighter jet, right? It's easy to point to those tangible things because they exist. And so economists' whole job is to say, yes, but if you hadn't done all that monetary intervention after, let's say, the Lehman Brothers housing crisis of 07, what would things look like? What might things look like today in terms of prices or housing or whatever it might be? And that's very, very difficult. But yet, that's why I think inane politics always beats sound economics politically, because people will vote for politicians who advocate economically, crazy, untenable things because of this problem with the seen and the unseen. And the money production is part of that. Now, Ryan, I know that you track what we call true money supply, which is an Austrian measure of the money and supply on Mises.org. Just real quickly, talk a little bit about how that differs from traditional M1, M2, for example, money supply statistics, and also what the TMS is telling us right now with respect to money growth.
Well, so we at Mises.org, we just provide a monthly, most months, a measure of the money supply movements. And that's money supply growth is pretty much always positive. So what you're really just looking at is how fast is the money supply growing. And the method we're using is the Rothbard-Salerno method, which they came up with in the 80s. And it's similar to M2, but it's much more sensitive. So the swings are much larger, and it's easier to identify a real change in the trend there. And it's mostly M2, but what Rothbard wanted to do was really take out of that forms of money that the Fed was calling money, but weren't really readily available. And so weren't really money in the sense of this is something that could be spent because it's liquid now. Mm-hmm. And so Rothbard wanted to focus on that. And so you will find a similar trend to what the Fed measures in terms of money supply, but you will find that it starts to swing downward a little before the Fed's measures do. So you get a little better warning and a little better measure of is the money supply really starting to shrink at point X. And so it's helpful in that way. And if we do look at it, we do find that in a lot of cases, most cases really, of course, the time lag is always difficult to guess on. Some are larger, some are shorter, but you'll usually get 2 or 3 or maybe 4 years ahead of a recession. You will start to see that money supply measure starts to really decline in terms of its growth rate. So you saw that in the lead up to the housing collapse in 2007. You started to see money supply growth it almost went to 0% in 2007, but had been declining significantly since 2004 and really went down in 2005. So you knew something was up at that point. And you saw that also similarly back in the late 1990s, leading up to the recession then. And so Frank very much, he uses his own measure, but his general scheme is correct, I think, which is that once you start to see money supply significantly start to slow, when you see the growth start to slow, then you have good reason to believe that something's happening out there that's setting things up for a recession in the not too distant future. It's not going to happen immediately. There's all these lags, which causes political problems, as you just noted. But this does help us to see, all right, have we reached that point in the economy where things are starting to slow? And often this can be triggered by rising interest rates and policies that the Fed is putting in to actually tighten monetary growth, but not necessarily. In some cases, you will start to see maybe you just have a confidence problem where banks are starting to make fewer loans. People are paying off loans and they're not making new loans enough to match the loans that are coming in and being paid off. So then your money supply starts to shrink. And then that should raise some eyebrows as to, okay, are we on the road to recession at this point? So it can be a very useful measure. And of course, with this last peak in money supply growth, it was just off the charts, reached 40% year over year in money supply growth. I mean, just huge, like nothing we've seen certainly since World War II. And then that, of course, then collapsed from 40% growth down to about 7% growth. And that gave us real reason to believe, well, there's a significant contraction in the works here. The Fed could keep plowing money into the situation and just keep the price inflation going and get sort of this stagflationary growth situation continued, maybe a Japanification of the situation. But because of price inflation causing political problems, I don't know if they're going to be able to pull that off. It looks like they really are stuck with having to trigger an inflation. But we already saw that there was a lot in the works in terms of a slowing economy, going back really to as soon as that money supply started to turn around and decline in its growth rate.
Yeah, if I'll just mention, too, that I have a paper with Ryan Griggs in the QJAE where we looked at the connection between the Austrian. I don't know if it's exactly the same measure that you're using, Ryan, but it's very similar, where we using the theoretical definition that Rothbard and Salerno came up with for the true money supply, and we constructed a series of that, and then looked to see when that thing is growing, has high rate of growth, the yield curve tends to be very positive, like upward sloping, and when that thing goes has slow rates of growth, then the yield curve is very flat or even flips and inverts. And so it all kind of dovetails together that it makes sense both just empirically. That's why, since that's correlated with the yield curve inverting, and we know the yield curve inverting is correlated with recessions, it makes sense that the Austrian money supply, goes hand in hand with that. But again, even just intuitively, the idea being when they're pumping in new money, that tends to push down interest rates, and which interest rates are the most malleable? It's shorter term ones. So that's why the yield curve would, be upward sloping, that longer term yields would be higher than, short rates would be pushed down more with new money getting injected into the system. And then when the Fed tightens and the banks, get nervous and they stop making loans and the money supply tightens, then it's more short rates that shoot up. And so that's what tends to make the yield curve invert. So it's not surprising that when the Fed tightens and the banks stop lending, that a recession happens not in the far distant future.
Well, we will provide a link to that Quarterly Journal of Austrian Economics article that Bob just mentioned for people who want to get into something deeper on that. We'll also provide a link to the article by Frank Shostak that we've alluded to a couple times about a more Austrian view or definition of recession. So, Ryan, I want to just confirm with you a couple of things. The TMS, the true money supply, which is what we've called it, which is a Murray Rothbard, Joe Salerno creation from way back. So that's almost always positive. In other words, there's almost always an overall rate of growth in the true money supply. So what you're really measuring is there's always growth. What you're really measuring is the rate of growth. And you're suggesting that during the peak of the COVID mania, when the Fed was really going crazy, and rapidly buying assets and expanding and also Congress was going crazy, putting out fiscal policy dollars into the economy, that we were at something like a 40% year-over-year rate of growth, at least in those months?
Yes, for several months you were in excess of 35%, and really for 11 months you were just off the charts at over 25% growth year over year.
But as you point out, let's say in 05, where you start to see a really serious, you see some slowing in 04 in the TMS rate, and then in 05 you see it almost go to zero. If you had sold your house and started to rent and dumped every stock you own and shorted the moon in 05, you would have missed out on another year or two of gains perhaps. But in general, you'd have done pretty well, and then started buying again maybe in 2011, 2012, stop renting, go buy a house then. Start buying stocks again. I mean, that's, we're not prognosticators, but I've heard worse tools, it's better than a Ouija board.
That's right. I mean, if the money supply is going down, I mean, in spite or not going down, if the rate of increase is going down, in spite of all of the efforts that the central bank does to increase the money supply. Now, of course, the central bank isn't just the only thing going on there, right? Commercial banks are a major factor there. And that's why you could see real slowing there, because the central bank just doesn't flip a switch and decide, well, how much is the money supply going to increase this month? Mm-hmm. And so there are other factors in the economy that point to either fears or there's problems in terms of do we have credit-worthy people we can make loans to? Lots of issues that the banks could be seeing in the economy that would cause them to slow the rate at which they're increasing the money supply. And if they're actually getting that to really slow, especially if that occurs at a time where the Fed is keeping interest rates low in an attempt to just have general loose money policy, that suggests that somebody's seeing something in the economy that you should probably be concerned about, and it might be pointing toward a contraction. And as you say, I can't time it out. Oh, gee, this is going to be 14 months later. The unemployment rate's then going to shoot up to 10%. That's too hard to predict. But, I mean, generally it's a fairly reliable predictor in terms of something's going on that's going to be a cause of contraction in the economy.
What would be interesting would be to see in real time the personal investment balance sheets of central bankers around the world and of, let's say, investment bank honchos, people at places like BlackRock and Goldman Sachs. It would really be interesting to see on a personal level what these guys and gals were doing, let's say in 2005. I wonder if some of them did pretty well in their personal lives during that period when a lot of the country was suffering. But I want to get back to this idea that was mentioned before, and I'll ask Bob this for starters. Daniel Lacalle, the great Spanish economist, had an article earlier this week on Mises.org, and he pointed out what Ryan alluded to, which is, hey, if people just save less money than normal, or even dig into savings and go into negative savings, start spending their savings, or on the flip side, increase their credit card consumption, increase their debt spending, both of those two things help the economic numbers in terms of GDP, right? That makes it look like that we're not in recession because people are spending money. But yet at the same time, they're just cannibalizing their own future. So is this a real phenomenon? Is this something that happens and that fools us into thinking things are rosier than they are?
Well, yeah, I think so. Because again, another example would be just if government just starts spending money on bridges and things. So you would think that even notwithstanding our quibbles about like, oh, is that really productive socially and things like that, you would think that, well, if they were spending all that money on public works projects, those resources are coming from somewhere else. So shouldn't that make private sector GDP drop, either consumption or investment? And so, even given that it's in a sense cheating, like shouldn't the numbers balance out? And yet they don't. There does seem to be some slippage where if the government does spend a bunch of money, like I said, during World War II, it was partly because they had price controls and didn't adjust for that. So that's partly how they got away with it statistically. But yes, it does seem like there is some slippage, even though you might think theoretically, if the government spends more over here, that should cause spending to drop over here. And so that shouldn't be able to goose the overall number. It doesn't seem like it nets out that way. And so part of it could be just, in terms of understanding the logic behind it. And this is partly what happens during like a boom bust cycle that Mises talks about. There's malinvestment. And so there's a lot of what he called capital consumption. And so what can happen is, like, let's say there's a merchant and normally, or let's say a bakery, put it this way. I think it's the example I use a lot. And so if it's a $100,000 oven, if prices were stable and it lasts 10 years, then every year the baker should put aside $10,000 in a sinking fund to be able to replace the thing. And during an inflationary boom, if he's just putting aside $10,000, not realizing that, actually the new oven's going to cost whatever, $200,000, not $100,000 when it comes due, there's a sense in which, his spending is the same and he's spending it on consumer goods. And so that can sort of show the problem where the official numbers output seems good. He's having a good time. He's buying stuff for, himself and his wife and so forth. And yet those clearly something's not right. And the chickens come home to roost down the road. So in terms of like stepping back and looking at the macro economy and saying, but what's happening physically? It's that resources that should have gone into maintenance and like repairing the long-term capital goods that are getting worn out each year, where there's some depreciation that gets booked if it's correct, but you didn't need to physically replace it that quarter or that year. If they're not making those long-term projects to like dovetail to replace the things that are getting worn out, that's the sense in which, down the road, we're going to realize we don't have as many factories and we don't have as many tools because we should have been replacing them all along and we weren't. We were making TVs and, pizzas and things like that. So the flow of real output seemed fine, but if the composition changed, like over time, that was degrading the capital structure. And that kind of stuff is hard for the numbers to pick up.
Well, what strikes me, Ryan, is apart from recessions, if you're a middle-class family, let's say, or upper middle class, and there's some economic uncertainty, you generally tend to start holding on to money. You spend a little less. You might, if you're worried about your job or your savings or your kids' college because of an uncertain economy, you might say, well, we're going to go out to eat less. Or we're not going to join that. We're not going to re-up our club membership this year. Or we're not going to go to Europe like we had planned, right? We're not going to do any of those things. But if you're a poor person and you live really close to the bone, let's say you live off of welfare funds. Let's say you live off a tiny amount of Social Security or disability. Let's say you live off of a minimum wage job and have a few kids. All of a sudden, almost every dollar you spend is basics: rent, food, gas or bus or whatever to work, clothing, right? So it's a lot easier for middle-class people to adjust as they have to, let's say, to the kind of, I think, uneasy environment we live in today. But I think sometimes when we're talking about the economy in terms of these numbers and everything, we forget the more human side of it, which is that, poor people don't really have leeway on spending. How much less do you spend at the dollar store or something as a result of a bad economy? I think the answer is not much.
Well, and you can't save at all in those sorts of situations where you're already, so you were eating the cheapest food you could find so that you could sock a little bit away for an emergency. And now you can't do that because even the cheap food now is more expensive.
Yeah.
So there's no savings left. And so, the people at the margin, the people at the low end of that economic scale, they, of course, are the ones that suffer the worst in real terms, in terms of these price increases. And, they benefited greatly during a short period of time when we put all those checks in the mail and everyone was talking about how great it was that we had effectively a universal minimum income. But then it turned out that just drove prices through the roof. And now those savings are gone. Those households, they don't have those savings left. And now they're going into debt. And most of them can only get consumer debt. They may not have a house that they can get a HELOC on or something like that. And so now you have no savings. You have higher debt. You've got food prices that are up. Of course, buying a used car is extremely expensive. Automobile maintenance is quite remarkably high. And all of that is, and you say, well, what if he's a mechanic, is doing real well? Well, he's making more money. He's got to spend it on other things. And so, yeah, there's going to be a lot of suffering in that field. And these ideas to help offset the cost of gas by sending everyone a gift card so they can buy more gas. I mean, this is just going to cause more of the same consumer price inflation. And they were able to cover a lot of that up through their earlier policies where they were only giving money to investment bankers and big banks in order to keep the system liquid. And then they were able to lock a lot of that up in reserves, and that just caused massive asset price inflation. And that didn't trickle down fully to food and some other necessities the way that it might have. And so you were kind of putting off the disaster into the future a little bit, although it did make rich people a whole lot richer, and everyone else was kind of just flat, basically. And homeowners weren't even necessarily benefiting in much of the country. It was only in certain coastal markets where you had the real exploding home prices. So, yeah, Boston bankers, New York investment guys, West Coast rich folk, all doing magnificently well. But it wasn't necessarily driving up the price of food, but now we're in that situation. So just printing more money isn't going to help. And unfortunately, it seems that the only situation then is to endure demand destruction to bring those prices back down. But that's not going to be a pretty situation at all for someone who's already depleted their savings.
Well, final question then, speaking of ugly scenarios, certainly we would argue, perhaps the three of us, that a recession is necessary, that it's a corrective to all the malinvestment and all the problems brought about by bad fiscal and monetary policy over not just the last couple of years, really maybe the last 15 years, depending on how you want to look at it. You're talking about the last 100 years, depending on how you want to look at it, that there's a bill to be paid. And so central bankers and politicians tend to do everything in their power to avoid a recession, at least a nominal one, whereas we would say, no, you need the recession. That's the corrective. So let me just get both of you to opine on what do you think it might look like for the next couple of years, and how bad will it be?
I think it's going to be pretty bad. Just to give one statistic here, so the federal debt held by the public, right? So that we're not doing stuff like the Social Security Trust Fund and things like that. This is, the standard measure that economists use as a percent of GDP. That went from about 80% at the beginning of 2020. It shot up to 105%, and now it's come down to a more modest. It's about 98% for this first quarter of 2022, which is the most recent figure we have. So, I mean, that is just really high, much higher than people would have forecasted even 10 years ago. Things like entitlement spending, Social Security, like the mismatch, and they're already blowing through the so-called trust fund for that. Things that when I was growing up were always in the future, like, oh wow, they got to really reform Social Security because down the road there's going to be a mismatch and benefit checks are going to exceed what's coming in from workers' payroll contribution, and that already happened. That switchover point, and so they're already eating into that. So these things are just looming problems, and with interest rates having been at rock bottom levels, so I mean, just even going back to quote normal yields on Treasury debt, that's going to be unsustainable even if the economy were fine. And so when you add on top of that, if we're getting into a situation where they have to raise rates fairly rapidly because CPI is just unacceptably high, and that is going to cause a recession in and of itself, but then on top of that, all of a sudden the federal government finds that just servicing the debt is now the biggest item, and they can't be they got to cut back on food stamps or whatever because they just can't afford it. I mean, that it's going to be. They've really painted themselves into a corner is what I'm getting at. I think the profligate policies, both under Republicans and Democrats the last decade or two, are really going to come home to roost in the next few years.
Yeah, I mean, there are so many different factors this time that are different from a normal recession. When you go back and you study, say, the recessions of the early 1980s, where I don't know how useful that is now in understanding what a recession would look like, because there's just so much more federal involvement in the economy. The debt and monetary situation is so different that, boy, I just have a hard time guessing what they're going to try to do to address it. I can't imagine they'll just sit back and say, well, we got to let it happen like they might have in some earlier time periods, or say we just got to grit our teeth and it'll be morning in America again soon. And that the ideal situation would be a very severe and short recession, right? Because we are human beings, we deplete our savings, you can go a while with eating small meals and cutting back, but that gets real tiresome and maybe even dangerous after a longer period of time. And so shorter is better, even if it does mean massive unemployment for a short time. And of course, that would bring down prices too, as well, to have that sort of decline in demand. What I fear is that you would have something that was like a more severe version of the Great Recession, which was had this long timeline for job growth coming back. And even though you had to claw back up into growth almost immediately afterward, but then you had these years of really weak growth, and people forget that in 2012 the economy was really weak and it looked like it might even go back into recession. And these were all real undesirable times, really, in terms of economic growth. That real boom, when you look at real median income in the U.S., household or individual or otherwise, really didn't even begin until about 2015, when you started to get back to where you had been really in 2000. You had like a 15-year period of not real growth where, it went up pretty high in 2007, 2008, and then collapsed, and then you were clawing your way out of that for years afterward. And so that the good old days, what we remember as just the great growth period, that's really kind of just like 2017, 18, and 19, where that was just amazing. We had exceeded those earlier peaks. And so if we have something that is long and kind of drawn out and moderate and mediocre and like we experienced in those years after 2008, but even more severe, that would be, I think, just terrible. But that was what we got from a long period of the government trying out different sorts of interventions, and there was a lot of money printing, and the U.S. version of doing whatever it takes, as the ECB was famously saying it was going to do. So you ended up with this very low growth decade. And I guess we could have that. We could then be in a situation of declining real living standards, but real low growth, because we're told that we have to do all of these price controls, or we have to increase the money supply in order to get back some stability. And then you've just got a situation where it doesn't, the numbers don't make it look that bad, but you just feel like you're spinning your wheels and going nowhere fast as like a family that's trying to build some wealth and provide an education for your children and that sort of thing. So there's so much that they can do, so many bad things they can do that their hands used to be tied on prior to 2008 that, boy, I mean, I fear the different sorts of damage that they might be able to do just so they can see like they're doing something, and they'll just thrash around trying a bunch of different stuff, and you end up with another lost decade, even worse than the one from about 2008 to 2016 or so.
Well, buckle up, folks. I want to thank Ryan McMaken for joining us. I want to thank my co-host Bob Murphy, as always, and hope everybody has a great weekend. Be sure to catch our show next week. We're going to have Alex Epstein with his new book on fossil fuels, and Bob and I are going to do a deep dive with him into all the economics behind energy in this country. So that said, thanks, guys, and have a great weekend, ladies and gentlemen.
Check back next week for a new episode of the Human Action Podcast. And in the meantime, you can find more content like this at Mises.org.